The year is 1944. The air in the German High Command bunkers, from the Westphal command posts to the sprawling headquarters in France, was a stagnant mixture of stale pipe tobacco, maps, and supreme, unshakable self-regard. These were the architects of the Blitzkrieg, men steeped in the martial purity of maneuver warfare, who had conquered a continent by prioritizing speed and decisive aggressive action. For them, logistics was a grim necessity. For the Americans, they believed, it was a terminal disease. General Feldmarschall Gunther von Kluge, despite the pressures of the crumbling Eastern Front, often returned to the same cynical analysis of the American invasion. He would trace the lines of the Allied beachheads with a silver-tipped pointer, his voice ringing with a thin, almost educated contempt. "Look at this, gentlemen," he would often challenge his staff. "The Americans have landed a spectacle of excess. They have deposited not just an army, but a mountain range of materiel upon our shores. They require 10 tons of supplies for every soldier, merely to maintain their advance. 10 tons! Our own divisions, operating on the pure principles of economy, require a fraction of that." This was not just observation, it was the foundation of their defensive strategy. The German commanders had been trained to fight with what they could carry and what they could capture. They were masters of living off the land, of relying on local rail networks, and of conserving every drop of fuel. The American appetite for oil, ammunition, and every imaginable comfort, from Coca-Cola to entire stocks of replacement parts, was interpreted not as power, but as slothful dependence. The American soldier, in their view, was a slave to his supply chain, incapable of the lean, hungry resilience of the Lanzer. Their intelligence reports, often accurate in their raw counts, were fatally flawed by this ingrained prejudice. They knew the Americans were pouring in over 60,000 tons of supplies daily across the Normandy beaches. But instead of seeing the terrifying industrial might behind that number, they saw only fragility. They focused on the vulnerability of the supply line, which, as the Allied forces drove inland, stretched further and further away from the safety of the ports. "Their army is not a cohesive fighting unit," scoffed General Oberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, leaning over a map marking the expanding gap between the coast and General Patton's tanks. "It is an extension of the Detroit assembly line, and like any assembly line, it is incredibly vulnerable to disruption. A thin thread, gentlemen, is all they have, a road-bound umbilical cord that can be severed with a single, well-placed ambush or a concentrated artillery strike." They spoke of American gasoline demand as a military liability. They had calculated the immense fuel cost of operating thousands of large, heavy trucks, comparing it unfavorably to their own use of horse-drawn caissons and localized fuel dumps. The Americans were, in their minds, choking on their own oil. Their advance, they assured one another, was mathematically unsustainable. It defied the historical laws of friction and attrition. They planned for a logistical stall. Their defensive formations were positioned to withstand an initial punch, but their true strategic weapon was time. They believed that within weeks, the sheer physics of distance, mud, and endless consumption would force Patton spearheads to halt, their fuel tanks empty, their artillery shells unreplenished. It was an expectation rooted in their own experience, but fundamentally blind to the unprecedented scale of American economic mobilization. The laughter and confident dismissals that filled those headquarters were not just psychological comfort, they were the very bedrock of German strategy in the West. They planned to starve the enemy, to isolate them, to force a surrender not through brilliant tactical maneuver, but through the humiliation of empty gas cans. They were utterly convinced the enemy would collapse under the weight of their own needs. The generals sat there, sipping their coffee, convinced of their superior understanding of the necessities of war, utterly unaware that the true genius of the coming American victory lay not in the tank itself, but in the relentless, unending river of fuel and ammunition that would soon flow, against all historical precedent, to keep it moving. They were blind to the industrial storm gathering on their horizon, a storm that would soon expose the fatal flaw in their most cherished military doctrines.
The breakout from the Normandy beachheads was a magnificent military success, a triumph of courage and sustained pressure. Operation Cobra had shattered the German defenses, opening a vast, rolling landscape for the Allied armies, and General George S. Patton's newly unleashed Third Army had begun its legendary, lightning-fast dash across France. The momentum was exhilarating, intoxicating, but beneath the rush of victory, a cold, hard truth was rapidly setting in. America was outrunning its own ability to fight. This was the crisis, the logistical chasm. As Patton's tanks chewed up the miles, the distance between the fighting front and the secured ports of Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches grew geometrically. Every mile gained was a mile lost to the supply chain. The front line now stretched nearly 400 miles inland, demanding a perpetual staggering tonnage of materiel merely to sustain its existence. The volume required was unprecedented, 500,000 gallons of gasoline a day for Patton's army alone, plus mountains of artillery shells, small arms ammunition, engineering equipment, medical supplies, and basic rations. The supply system was collapsing under the weight of its own success. The rail lines, the traditional lifeblood of a European campaign, had been deliberately and meticulously pulverized by months of Allied bombing to prevent German reinforcement. Now that same success had become a crippling liability. Bridges were rubble, marshalling yards were twisted metal cemeteries, and the few remaining lines were hopelessly congested, slow, and far too damaged for high-speed operation. The ports themselves were becoming a monument to unmovable abundance. Ships arrived daily, ceaselessly, unloading their crucial cargo onto the beaches where the supplies immediately stacked up into towering, impossible pyramids. Crates of essential goods sat baking in the French sun, tantalizingly close, yet utterly useless. The problem wasn't production, it was mobility. The war effort had become a game of inches, where the bottleneck wasn't the enemy's resolve, but the desperate, chaotic miles between the coast and the front lines. The commanding officers in the field began to feel the sharp, agonizing pinch. Reports flowed into headquarters, each one a litany of desperate shortages. Tank companies were ordered to ration gasoline by the quart, their mighty engines idling when they should have been roaring toward Paris. Artillery units, having just discovered the enemy was vulnerable, had to stand down their bombardments, saving their shells only for the most critical targets. The initiative, the precious, irreplaceable factor of momentum, was bleeding away with every gallon they failed to deliver. The German generals, sitting hundreds of miles away, were right about one thing. The American supply line was a thin thread, but it was a thread they couldn't see. A network of hastily repaired, overcrowded roads that were being pushed far beyond any reasonable limit. Trucks broke down constantly under the strain, the roads themselves turned into rutted quagmires by the continuous traffic, and the sheer inefficiency of having every vehicle make a 400-mile round trip, often returning empty, was eating up fuel that should have gone to the fighting tanks. For every gallon that reached a tank at the front, 2 gallons had been burned simply driving it there. The crisis was accelerating. The weather was turning. The prospect of the autumn rains promised to turn the existing road chaos into a nightmarish sea of mud, grinding all movement to a halt. If the advance stalled, the Germans would have time to regroup, to fortify, and to launch the counterattacks they had been dreaming of. The very tide of the war, the ability to keep the enemy reeling and disorganized, was hinging on an immediate, revolutionary solution to the seemingly unsolvable problem of moving sheer tonnage faster than anyone thought possible. The Allied victory was not threatened by German firepower, but by its own inability to close the terrifying distance. The fate of Europe lay in the balance, balanced precariously on the axle of a truck somewhere between the beaches of Normandy and the desperate front lines. The call for a miracle of logistics became a shout of pure desperation.
The strategic map room in Paris was no longer a place of glory. It was a scene of escalating panic. The initial euphoria of the breakthrough had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of logistical collapse. Patton was screaming for fuel. His forward tank divisions were rationing gasoline by the thimble, some companies reduced to burning aviation fuel, a desperate, destructive measure. The rail lines, the traditional arteries of European warfare, lay shattered, bombed into obsolescence by the very planes that were now demanding fuel to fly. The Allied advance, the greatest single ground operation in history, was on the cusp of an agonizing, self-inflicted stall. The realization struck military leadership with the force of a physical blow. The only way to save the momentum was to build a new transportation system from scratch, overnight, using the only vehicle available in sufficient numbers, the truck. This was the moment of conception for the Red Ball Express, born not of elegant planning, but of sheer industrial-age desperation. The command was given to the Transportation Corps, who were tasked with an impossible mandate: move 12,000 tons of supplies a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, over 400 miles of hostile, damaged roads. The first step was an act of brutal territorial innovation. 2 dedicated highways, totaling nearly 700 miles, were instantly designated and cordoned off. One for the northbound stream of loaded trucks and the parallel route reserved exclusively for the southbound empties. This single, massive gesture created an irreversible one-way system of logistics, an artery of war. Any vehicle caught traveling the wrong direction faced instant confiscation and court-martial. The system was marked by giant red circles, the Red Ball priority designation, painted hastily onto signs, bridges, and even trees. To execute this plan, the Army went on a massive scavenger hunt. Thousands of 2.5-ton GMC CCKW trucks, the ubiquitous deuce into halves, were yanked from every corner of the rear echelon. They were often ill-maintained, frequently overloaded, and forced into a continuous cycle of operation for which they were never designed. Every spare tire, every reserve jerry can, and every mechanic's wrench suddenly became the most critical asset on the entire European continent. But the machine needed a motor, and the motor was human. The call went out, and the burden of execution fell disproportionately upon the African-American segregated service units. In an army that often denied them combat roles, 75% of the 23,000 men who would eventually drive the Red Ball Express were black soldiers from the quartermaster truck companies. These men were the invisible infantry, suddenly thrust into the very center of the war's critical juncture. Their reality was a nightmare of continuous motion and profound exhaustion. They drove in massive, tightly packed convoys of 50 to 100 trucks, instructed to maintain a relentless 35-mile-per-hour speed, regardless of weather, road conditions, or exhaustion. Their windows were often cracked, their cabs were stifling in the sun and freezing in the chill, and the constant roar of the engine hammered their eardrums. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Drivers operated on rotating, non-stop shifts, often pulling 20 or 30 hours at the wheel, sometimes more, held awake by black coffee, benzodrine tablets, and the sheer, adrenaline-fueled terror of losing the truck ahead in the dead of the blackout. They battled white line fever, the hypnotic gaze brought on by sleep deprivation, where the road seemed to wobble and phantom figures danced in the periphery. Accidents were frequent and brutal. Trucks veered off the road, collided in massive chain reactions, or crashed spectacularly when drivers succumbed to microsleeps. Each wreck meant the loss of vital supplies and often the life of a driver. Their exposure to enemy threat was constant. Though officially a rear echelon operation, the Express was always vulnerable. Luftwaffe pilots, desperate and opportunistic, frequently strafed the long, tempting columns, scattering vehicles and igniting precious fuel. German infiltration groups, snipers and saboteurs, had been bypassed by the main advance and frequently ambushed isolated trucks, forcing the weary drivers, who were often issued only minimal self-defense weapons, to fight for their lives and their cargo. The maintenance points became the heart of this logistical organism. Scattered every 50 miles, these were often muddy, hastily established garages where exhausted mechanics worked miracles. Engines that overheated from continuous running, axles snapped by overloading, and tires shredded by constant speed and poor roads were stripped, repaired, or replaced in relentless cycles. The motto was, "Keep the trucks rolling," and the mechanics achieved inhuman efficiency, fueled by grit and the knowledge that Patton's momentum depended entirely on their ability to beat the clock. This was not just transport, it was a war of endurance. It was a defiant rejection of the German theory of warfare, which preached economy and maneuver. The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of American industrial volume, deployed with a desperate improvisational courage. It was ugly, wasteful, and profoundly unfair to the men who drove it, but it was unstoppable. By late August, the system had reached its peak, a rolling torrent of steel and gasoline, delivering a crucial 12,500 tons of supplies daily, a tonnage that represented the absolute difference between victory and an agonizing strategic deadlock. The impossible logistical barrier had been breached, and the surge was about to deliver a profound shock to the arrogantly confident German high command.
The German war doctrine, a beautiful, logical construct of military theory, was built upon the expectation of friction, the inherent, inevitable belief that distance, weather, and the sheer challenge of supplying a massive army would eventually slow down the American advance. This was their strategic bedrock. They had successfully destroyed the rail networks. They knew the French roads were inadequate, and the weather was turning. The calculation was simple, elegant, and seemingly infallible. Patton's tanks would stop, and when they did, the Wehrmacht would deliver a crippling, decisive counterblow. But the Red Ball Express, a defiant creation of American industrial urgency, turned that pristine calculation into a strategic fantasy. The immense, grinding effort, the 24-hour shifts, the bypassed regulations, the relentless flow of 12,500 tons of supplies per day meant that Patton did not just resume his advance, he achieved a terrifying, sustained acceleration. The Third Army's tanks, engines roaring and fuel gauges full, performed a kind of military magic that defied their enemy's core assumptions. The breakthrough became a hurricane of armor. The speed was so profound that it became the ultimate weapon. Patton's columns were not engaging in methodical siege warfare. They were bypassing entire German garrisons, encircling towns, and appearing on the horizon of key defensive positions days, sometimes weeks, before German intelligence calculated they could possibly arrive. This shock was systemic. German field commanders, planning their defenses based on established, slow, predictable movements, would establish strong points only to receive frantic reports that American armor was already behind them, cutting supply routes and sowing panic in the rear. The carefully constructed defensive lines along river barriers were rendered instantly irrelevant because the Americans arrived with the speed necessary to secure crucial bridges before the retreating Germans could implement demolition protocols. They were always too late to defend and always too early to retreat effectively. In German headquarters, the confusion bordered on panic and disbelief. Reports from the front were contradictory, painting a picture of an enemy that defied the laws of physics and logistics. Generals scoffed at the numbers, demanding multiple verifications, unable to reconcile their disciplined, resource-scarce philosophy with the American reality. They saw divisions that should have been immobilized by fuel shortage suddenly executing sweeping flanking maneuvers. They saw artillery bombardment sustained at a rate that suggested a limitless supply of shells. Their initial mocking certainty that the Americans would choke on their own abundance was replaced by the terrifying, paralyzing realization that American abundance was, in fact, limitless, mobile, and utterly indifferent to their defensive strategy. The Express delivered not just fuel, but strategic flexibility. It enabled Patton to pivot instantly, exploiting every discovered weakness. When intelligence indicated a vulnerable point, the necessary supplies, tons of high-explosive shells, replacement tank treads, and tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline could be rushed to that exact point within hours. This tactical responsiveness meant that Germans were perpetually reacting to an enemy that moved faster than their communication lines, never able to consolidate forces or concentrate their strength effectively against a predictable foe. The most devastating psychological victory was delivered at the Battle of Metz and throughout the relentless drive toward the German border. Patton's decision to press the attack immediately, maintaining the pressure rather than waiting for slow, conventional supply routes to catch up, was a direct consequence of the Red Ball Express's demonstrated, proven reliability. That sustained, brutal aggression, fueled by the non-stop roar of the GMC trucks hundreds of miles away, broke the German defensive spirit. Their logistical arrogance had led them to believe in a natural, immutable limit to the American attack. The Red Ball Express proved there was no such limit, only the vast, overwhelming, and relentlessly flowing capacity of American industry and will. The triumph was not merely a military victory won by tanks and guns. It was the definitive victory of the service corps over the strategist, of the truck over the treatise. It was the moment the German High Command realized their fundamental, fatal error. They had underestimated the sheer, terrifying power of American logistics to transform the nature of modern warfare, ensuring that while German soldiers fought bravely, they did so on a battlefield constantly being reshaped, defined, and supplied by the indefatigable, triumphant roar of the Red Ball Express.
The Red Ball Express ceased operations in November 1944, having fulfilled its desperate, grueling mission. The German High Command ultimately capitulated, defeated not just by infantry and armor, but by the relentless, overwhelming flow of American industrial might. The final act of this logistical drama is a profound, lasting legacy that stretches far beyond the muddy roads of France. It is the story of how an improvised solution to a dire crisis fundamentally re-engineered the DNA of modern military supply. The German generals, steeped in classical military theory, had dismissed logistics as merely a supporting function. The Red Ball Express proved it was a decisive weapon, the ultimate force multiplier. The efficiency and scale demonstrated became the new, brutal standard for mechanized conflict. The core principles established under duress became permanent doctrine. The power of dedicated arteries, the one-way, controlled highway system established by the Red Ball, became the blueprint for managing high-volume transport in active theaters. This concept of streamlined, prioritized movement, free from the friction of civilian or opposing traffic, is utilized in every major military deployment today. The reliance on motorized mass. The Express proved that massive, continuous motor transport could, when necessary, entirely supersede shattered rail networks. It solidified the role of the robust military truck, the Deuce and a Half and its successors, as the essential backbone of ground forces, capable of projecting power deep into denied territory. The influence of the Red Ball Express quickly became apparent in subsequent crises. It provided the direct organizational and conceptual framework for the legendary Berlin airlift,
1948 to 1949, where the principle of continuous, rigid, high-volume flow, a literal airball express, was applied to aviation to save a city. In conflicts from Korea to the Persian Gulf, the central logistical challenge was always solved by creating a temporary, dedicated red ball-style solution to connect the point of supply to the point of need. Beyond the military, the experience of the Red Ball Express provided critical lessons that helped shape the explosive growth of modern commercial logistics and supply chain management. The methods for managing high-throughput, just-in-time delivery and dedicated transport corridors, though refined by computers and container ships, owe a conceptual debt to those early, desperate days on the French roads. Finally, the legacy is deeply human. The story of the Red Ball Express is a profound testament to the courage and perseverance of the segregated African-American soldiers who comprised the majority of its drivers. Fighting two wars at once, one against the Nazis, the other against institutional racism, they delivered victory through sheer, exhausting labor. Their extraordinary performance under impossible pressure directly led to greater scrutiny of military segregation policies, contributing significantly to President Truman's landmark 1948 executive order desegregating the armed forces. The mockery of the German High Command dissolved into utter defeat, replaced by a lasting truth. In modern warfare, the true genius lies not just in the man behind the gun, but in the system that ensures that gun and the vehicle that carries it never runs dry. The Red Ball Express stands as an indelible monument to that truth, a humble, roaring 20,000-man engine of victory that continues to define logistics strategy across the globe.